Underdog Superflex big board time. It's time to get drafting those quarterbacks. Listeners will know that we tend to leave those quarterbacks a little later at times, but that can really depend on where we're set up with draft slot. We are set up, we're in the queue, and we're ready to go. We're waiting for 3 people to get us kicked off, so we'll find out our draft order. One of the fun things of doing these shows is doing it on the fly and using those draft processes and draft strategies then to try and build that best lineup possible as we go through the roster construction. Superflex, always a lot of fun, Shawn. And Best Ball, even more fun. $500,000 in total prizes available at Underdog Fantasy in the Superflex big board. It's a $10 entry fee. There is $100,000 to first place, 260 team final in this particular kind of iteration of an Underdog Fantasy contest. If you're playing over at Underdog Fantasy, you can use the code RotoViz. That will get you a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100 while playing over there on a new account. So much fun, Shawn. My first Superflex draft over at Underdog this year. I'm looking forward to jumping into it. We talked on the last show about our preferred or our favorite landing spot in terms of draft selection. That was in a standard format. We are here in Superflex. How are you feeling? Have you enough of a want to get one of those top tier quarterbacks that you want to be early in that first round, or are you happy to be kind of mid to late first round and to pick up and try and smash on 2 of those elite level talents, whether that be wide receiver or running back?
What we did last season in the FFPC version that was so successful was to take Jalen Hurts at the end of the first round and then go with a single QB for a long time. Take 4 total, 3 either sleeper, breakout, what have you, QBs, and that worked well. As Geno Smith in the last round was big for us. One of the things here, as we kind of get familiar with how this contest is shaping up in the early going, we do see that the first 5 players off the board are QBs. That's not a surprise. Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields, Joe Burrow. Then you have Justin Jefferson sneak in there, but then 3 more quarterbacks: Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson, Trevor Lawrence. I think it would be interesting to hit Lawrence, in the back third of the first round. That might be similar to what we did last season. Then you have that early pick in round 2. Definitely like those top 5 quarterbacks. The field, has that more or less completely correct. You have that QB star, and then you can build off of it. You have the 2-3 turn where you have the early pick in the 3rd round. That's a very favorable spot to be in. And then as we kind of look through the rest of the draft, there are some interesting points at the QB position. You have guys like Jared Goff and Geno Smith, QB 15 and 16. They're going around pick 33, 36 in that range. So still very pricey. Then you see the rookies, the potential young stars going off around 60. Bryce Young first, a little bit before. CJ Stroud at 65, and then you have Anthony Richardson with the immense fantasy potential, but maybe the risk that he doesn't play early in the season going around 72. And then, Colm, you have to look down to our preferred sort of later targets. Desmond Ridder up to 98 now, in the situation where it really does look like the Atlanta Falcons are going to go with him. I would say that's still quite a bit too cheap. And then you have Sam Howell down at 115. So that gives us a feel for where those guys are, where we might need to take them in order to not miss them, and how the overall fit of QBs is going to work in this draft, where you're probably going to want 3 good ones.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in now and tell the listeners that we have got the 102 here, Shawn. So it is a situation where you mentioned that we got Jalen Hurts last year at the back end of the draft. He will possibly be available first here at the 2nd pick. Allen, Mahomes, Hurts tend to be the quarterbacks going in this range. Obviously, you have the option to potentially go with Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. With the 102, it probably is going to be very tricky to pass up one of those quarterbacks, and particularly if it's Hurts or Allen.
Exactly. And we like to play this in a pretty risky fashion, but once you have the pick to take one of the stars, you don't need to be risky. You don't need to be contrarian like you might do on occasion.
I think once you have one of those first 3 picks, and Josh Allen goes off the board, but when you have one of those first 3, I think you can, get into your head a little bit much. I think quarterback makes sense with those options. After that, from the 104 onwards, I'm very much open to changing it. But
So,
Patrick
Colm, who do you
Mahomes
like
is
here? We have
available.
Mahomes or Hurts.
I'm going to go with Hurts, but you can override me. Obviously, you're the controller, but he still as well last year, Shawn, up until the point where he wasn't playing in the money weeks. But I think that's a fine pick there. When we look at it, if you've the 101 there, are you going clearly with Allen? And if I wasn't drafting with you, would you go Mahomes over Hurts?
One of the things that we've seen happen in some formats recently is that once the Bills announced that they were going to try to avoid some of these hits on Josh Allen, then you saw Jalen Hurts jump up to that top spot. I think when you're looking at those three guys, you have a variety of types of risk with Allen where he can have a weaker passing season like he did last year where the accuracy just isn't there on some of the passes. Now, he could have still had huge numbers if they had connected on a few of the long passes that were there. So even when he plays poorly, his ceiling is such that, I mean, you're talking about a super high floor, super high ceiling. The risk of injury, and one of the reasons that they want to take so many hits is because he did injure his arm last season and then didn't pass as effectively. They don't want that to happen. We tend to think of in terms of hurting the legs, not being able to run. But obviously, Jalen Hurts was out as well with an upper body injury, that shoulder. Those two players, I think, do probably have the most seasonal upside, probably the most individual game upside. Patrick Mahomes probably is quite a bit safer, much less likely to be injured than they are. And so that is going to factor in for you when you consider that for someone who doesn't run a ton, and he does add a little bit of rushing value, I mean, again, his floor and ceiling just so high.
Yeah, you mentioned as well on the other side when we were starting with Trevor Lawrence being an option, he did go 108 in this. He went one selection ahead of Jamar Chase. I think interesting, when drafts play out at the end, to look through some of the potential options of where teams could have went different, depending on how quarterbacks fall in this draft. We are now at the back end into the start of the second round. It's been Deshaun Watson, Dak Prescott, Kirk Cousins, Tua Tagovailoa. So there's a lot of quarterbacks rolling off the board here. But that also is getting the advantage of one of those quarterbacks in the first three picks. You also then see the players get pushed down in terms of the wide receivers that would normally be going there, the running backs. So the likes of Cooper Kupp still on the board, Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill. Then you're into Jonathan Taylor, Devontae Adams, Ceedee Lamb. So lots of options going to be here for us when it gets back to our selection in 6 picks time. Stephon Diggs off the board. I really like, obviously, waiting on quarterback in these situations when you're at the back end of the draft, because in those situations you could load up on 2 of those names that I have just mentioned. But when you do have the top end of the quarterbacks with those first 3 selections, to be able then to have your options to set up here with one of these high-end options is something that I'm really looking forward to. The interesting part, I noticed, Shawn, you do not have AJ Brown starred in the queue here as we move forward. Is that more a case of just the price of stacking those 2 guys together? I think at this range, you're right at ADP. He may not even last to us, but any interest in pairing those 2 guys together? Or are you looking more towards Cooper Kupp, or is that just an oversight as you now add him to the queue?
A little bit of an oversight, but I think that he is mildly overvalued. Again, we talk about different ways that you can create these stacks. One of the things that we have done is to pair Washington Commander and Atlanta Falcons guys with the really cheap QBs late. He is still available here, as is Jonathan Taylor. Colm, which direction do you want to go? I mean, you can add AJ Brown.
I'm open to
those 2 guys together.
Yeah, I'm open to the AJ Brown pick, and there is one person having 2 selections before it gets back to us. But I do think that Eckler or Taylor will be available to us at the next pick as well. So I'm willing to go that way. I would love if Jonathan Taylor makes it back to us here at this point. Now I don't expect that, but I'm hoping that Eckler or Taylor will be here. Preference, obviously, Jonathan Taylor. Who goes off the board on that next selection. What's your thoughts here if both running backs go? We obviously have 30 seconds to make that pick. Garrett Wilson was the pick off the board. I'm quite happy again, and we talked about this in a recent show. I think Eckler is vastly undervalued, but we also have the option here of Ceedee Lamb, Devontae Adams in the mix as well. I made the last kind of push for AJ Brown, so I'll let you take the wheel here.
This is so tricky because we know these drafts are going to be very wide receiver heavy. We want to get that base. We already have a team with Austin Eckler. We have some sneaky running back options that we like that we haven't been able to load up on so far. Let's go ahead and focus on those guys. We'll get Lamb here. That gives us the elite 1-2 punch at receiver to go with Jalen Hurts, building a fantastic floor. Positionally, we're in good shape. We're going to be able to avoid both those QB runs and the wide receiver avalanche. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is another draft where running backs really fall. You look at the board currently, and even with Bijan going right there, for the next 5 picks by ADP would be running backs. We have Saquon Barkley. So again, Eckler falling. I was chatting with Connor this weekend, and we both agreed, kind of like we talked about on our show, that Eckler's floor and ceiling profile, the talent profile, still there. And it doesn't matter that much really where he goes. And one of the things that might be actually the worst for him would be to stay there if they move away from some of these dump off passes and try and get a big back in to take away those types of carries that he has, I wouldn't say struggled with, but it's definitely not his strong suit compared to some of the other elite running backs in the NFL. There are a lot of teams that Eckler could go to and his fantasy outlook would improve. And so from that perspective, I think that what we're seeing in drafts right now doesn't make that much sense.
He does go, Shawn, at the 308
to see the upside.
He does go at the 308, which is pick 32, and I just think I'm going to try and get Eckler when he's at those prices as much as we can. But I like the Lamb pick. I like obviously to get those wide receivers as much as possible. So I'm delighted with our start here of Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Ceedee Lamb. We do have 10 picks to go to our next selection. It's obviously when we're doing these shows, there can be a lot of time when you're this far away that talking about the players that are potentially available can be quite a tricky scenario. But looking forward to who's available there based on the start. And I know we could have Eckler in this team, but you mentioned the running backs getting pushed down. As we look through it, there is obviously a lot of purple on the board, which is the quarterback position, but a lot of wide receivers off the board. And I would expect that to continue. So we may even see some running backs potentially pushed down towards us. And I'm going to say it again, Shawn. Kyler Murray goes a pick 38 in this 402. I just continue to think that Kyler Murray is a bargain at this particular point of the season. Russell Wilson goes 2 picks after that. We are now, Shawn, about 6 picks away. Some tasty options available here for us on the overall board. But to give the listeners an idea of who has gone since our last selection, it was Devontae Adams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Devontae Smith, Austin Eckler, Geno Smith. Then we get Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins, Kenneth Walker, Derrick Henry, Kyler Murray, Nick Chubb, Russell Wilson, Josh Jacobs. That brings us up to pick 42, which is on the clock now. We are 4 selections away as Chris Olave goes off the board. Shawn, Tony Pollard, Travis Etienne, Ramondre Stevenson, Deebo Samuel. Some tight end options available potentially here. We will have 2 picks in the space of 4 selections. So we're kind of trying to pair up a couple of these options. Also the range where DeAndre Hopkins goes, who we drafted recently. Also the range where DK Metcalf goes. Who are you looking at this particular point in time as your dream 2, I guess we'll say?
Yeah, it's tough because there are huge advantages to being early in the draft. You see some of these values who have fallen into mid-round 4, and I mean, there's massive tier breaks really between those particular players and who we're going to get to pick from. The pick 41 was Josh Jacobs, had a fantastic season last year, looks set up very well again. Chris Olave lasting to pick 42, I think that is surprising when you think about how fantastic he was right off the bat. The metrics just through the roof. You hear a lot of talk about where he was, both commanding targets, the targets per route, and then the efficiency, the yards per target side of that, and doing that in an offense that wasn't that great. So, Colm, we're up. Tony Pollard goes. Travis Etienne or Ramondre Stevenson. This would be a fun spot to get a running back. Do you have a preference between those 2 guys?
No strong preference for either of them, so I'll let you toss it up here. I'm hoping to have a fair amount of both of these guys this season. So you go with Stevenson. I kind of have just Stevenson feels to me like he is more somebody who has come in and step forward each season. It's improving. It's in the right trajectory. Whereas with Etienne, it feels like there's been a couple of setbacks. He hasn't been fully healthy. He's been in, he's been out. When he's been in and used, he has looked just absolutely amazing. But yeah, Stevenson feels a little bit more of the ascending pick, and that feels a little bit weird to say because they're obviously both very young running backs. Etienne does go in the next selection. One more pick before it gets back to us. Shawn, I'm quite interested in the tight ends available here in Mark Andrews and TJ Hawkinson, but Deebo Samuel also there. and Jerry Jeudy also somebody who you have in the queue, but it feels to me like Samuel are one of the tight ends here.
Yeah, you let me select Jeudy.
No need for the selection now, Shawn. Deebo Samuel off the board.
Jeudy, I think, is the value here. He's the direction I would go drafting by myself. But I'm going to end up with a lot of Jeudy, so don't necessarily need him. Mark Andrews, this is right about ADP. Again, another player I was talking with Connor about. This seems like a slam dunk. So many different ways that he can be the league winner here. Obviously, we love TJ Hawkinson. He's one of the players who really panned out for us last season, both overall and then helping our specific best ball teams down the stretch. After he makes that transition to the Minnesota Vikings, the target percentage just explodes. And you see what he can really do when he is a dedicated option in the offense. You also kind of see where the number 2, number 3 targets in that passing game really are. The concern, I think, for him would simply be that if they do bring in a more dynamic number 2, then you drop down, at least to an extent. The other element here in a half PPR, where so much of his value does come as a target hog in the way, at least that they ran the offense down the stretch in 2022, is that Mark Andrews probably still a much more dynamic tight end. We watched him do it with a backup in 2021. We watched him do it as the main guy with Lamar Jackson in the first half of 2022. If you don't have that weak finish last season that was due to a variety of circumstances, which could occur again, but I think you're getting such a discount due to that when we have witnessed Andrews for significant time periods over the last couple of years as being competitive with or better than Travis Kelce when we think to Travis Kelce in 2023. Obviously, he's a draft target, and yet at the same time, even though the Chiefs lose Juju Smith-Schuster, you have to imagine that they have some plans for the NFL draft. They may still make some moves when we get some more cuts. They're going to have similar or better receiving options. You have Sky Moore who could emerge. You have Kadarius Toney who could emerge. Again, Travis Kelce should be the number 1 guy, but if we go through a time period, or if Mark Andrews is the tournament winner as he was in 2021, I don't think that will be a surprise, even though this is Superflex. And so you're dealing with different ADPs. To get him at pick 50, I think is perfect for this team because there just aren't that many difference makers at tight end.
And you mentioned, Shawn, the slow kind of finish the season. He did have a quite electric start in those first kind of 6 weeks, and then he had a dud with 0 receptions, and after that it was a lot quieter. But yeah, still big things I think in the forecast for Mark Andrews moving forward. You mentioned Jerry Jeudy, and he is somebody who we have talked about a few times. We drafted in the last Underdog draft we did in the past week. He goes at pick 62, which is the 602, and I think, again, that being a really extreme value there. I mentioned Deebo Samuel going off the board just before that, and then we mentioned the 2 tight ends. You do get almost a round of discount then after that on Jerry Jeudy. In terms of where you're ranking Jeudy this year, have you him right up there with Deebo and above those tight ends? You mentioned if we were going solo, you felt he was the value here.
I think his ability to command targets in a passing game that will be improved. I mean, he's just so clearly the guy at this point there. Deebo Samuel, a much bigger talent still, a more physical back. And I say back because of all the different things that he can do for that offense. And yet they're going to have some quarterback issues again. Not quarterback issues to the same extent that the Broncos have, just because the Broncos have Russell Wilson. But you have that element. You have so much competition for the touches. Colm, I love Deebo Samuel. I'll be getting plenty of him. But I think that Jerry Jeudy is going to be one of those guys who at this point next season is being drafted among the top 10 wide receivers. We come to a very nice area of the draft right here. Drake London goes at the 609. We have the 611. Christian Watson, Michael Pittman, Keenan Allen, Jackson Smith and Jigba. Keenan Allen, someone we've talked about as well, where the whole situation with these guys getting knocked in the Chargers offense, a little bit surprising.
Yeah, and Keenan Allen is somebody we've talked about a lot and haven't drafted. So as much as I would like to go for Watson here, I think we'll go with Keenan Allen. I think that's the...
Well, if you want Watson, I mean, it works well to take the value there. He's a player who generally is going about 8 picks earlier. Keenan Allen, someone who probably will fall through. You can't guarantee that, but Christian Kirk, Michael Pittman, the couple guys in between. So Gibbs goes at pick 73. Allen is still here. Michael Pittman as well, a player who still
correctly priced this year versus overpriced last year.
Yes, and still a good player, a good value at that price. So we will go Keenan Allen and Colm through 7 rounds. We have Jalen Hurts, Ramondre Stevenson, A.J. Brown, Ceedee Lamb, Christian Watson, Keenan Allen, and Mark Andrews. For me, that's the perfect structure. That's the perfect roster through 7 picks.
Love the reverse psychology there that worked. I was like, trying to give Shawn his Keenan Allen pick that we haven't gone for recently, and we get Allen and Watson, which has worked out quite nice there. Obviously, when you're on the 30-second clock, there's not a huge amount of time when you're at the turns. I like being at the turns in those situations because we have time then after to talk about what has happened. Quarterback going in that range, Shawn, I touched him on the recent show as well, as Kenny Pickett. He went there. I think he is one of those when you're starting to look at getting that second quarterback potentially. I do think he is in that range for me. If I haven't got a quarterback in that first round, he's where I start now to look ahead. Some of the players, though, that are in the queue who could make this team even more interesting, I think because we took Mark Andrews, maybe not as essential now in these next couple of rounds, but if he was to fall back to us, which may be a bit tricky, there is 16 selections to go before it does come back to us. Kyle Pitts is in there. J.K. Dobbins, the other tight end, though, that was there is Dallas Goedert. So lots of options, Shawn, here for us moving forward. I'm quite excited. It'd be amazing if somebody like a DeAndre Swift would fall down to us. I'm not really expecting that to happen. That would be about 10 picks after ADP, but we will have lots of options at these next couple of picks, which is always a good feeling. When you mentioned the structure we have after those 7 picks, that their structure is going to allow us a lot of flexibility here as we move forward. It feels like there is going to be no real pressure on us at any point to make a very, very specific move. It feels like we'll be able to go with the picks and the best players available that we want to go with. So I'm pretty positive here as we move forward. 11 picks away. I think it's too early, Shawn, to start getting our hopes up here on who might slide to us. But are you into that range of potentially looking for that second quarterback? The next pick will be around that Desmond Ridder range.
It will be. We have pick 95. He's going around pick 98. With Ridder, you have someone who, when you look at his last couple of years there at Cincinnati, very similar rushing lines to what people are excited about for Anthony Richardson. Now, we know he's not the same level of physical talent because no one is. And yet Desmond Ridder's athleticism was one of the things that just didn't get nearly enough attention in last year's draft process. Someone who shouldn't have fallen as late in the reality draft as he did. That doesn't mean he's going to necessarily hit with the Atlanta Falcons. Not an elite passer, and that offense can be tricky to run because Arthur Smith asks you to do a lot of run, pass, puts you in a lot of third downs. That's not really where you want to be as a quarterback. And so it's not to say that he's any type of no-brainer to hit and be a big star this season, but there are a lot of positives with his game, especially at this price. The tricky thing, Colm, as we look forward a little bit here, is how do we manage the Sam Howell pick who comes in at 115? Do we go ahead and take that selection at 98, or do we hope that it swings all the way back through? One of the things that makes it a little bit trickier today is that there's some reporting that the Titans are a team that could potentially look to go in the direction of moving up to the 3rd overall pick. That would make Ryan Tannehill, who's a little bit of a safety quarterback here, a little bit trickier. The other element that we're looking at, every team has 2 QBs at this point except for the 101. So this team picking in between us here has a shot at whichever quarterback we don't take. But the good part of that is that they don't pick again before our next selection. Of course, all the other teams do. Looking here at 95, this is Desmond Ridder, right?
Yeah, Desmond Ridder will take him. I was very tempted there, Shawn. I don't know if people are watching this on video. They'll have seen me kind of throw my head back in kind of a sadness, maybe even a rage. But DeAndre Swift did go 1 pick ahead. Would you have been willing, and I feel like maybe with what we're talking about you wouldn't have been willing. And in hindsight, I think looking at the running backs, they have a 3 running back team at that point with 1 quarterback. They do take Brock Purdy, probably would have taken Desmond Ridder there at that point. Would you have? I'm pretty sure we would have went Ridder and hoped that Swift made it back to us, but Swift going at pick 94, I felt like, making it a little bit further would have been nice. We are back on the clock, Shawn. We do have options. We could potentially go with our Sam Howell pick and lock up the quarterback position. Is there anyone after Howell that you're interested in? He is, for me, in quite a tier, unless we look at rookies above the rest of the guys available.
Yeah, I think he's the last really interesting quarterback. And so even though it's a pretty big reach by ADP, it just creates the perfect style of team to select him here, to have Jalen Hurts, to have Desmond Ridder, to have Sam Howell. If Ridder and Howell start, then you have 3 rushing quarterbacks. I think to load up on those 2 guys at this time of the season makes sense. Now, you're taking on some risk. You may have some teams that you look back and say, well, that team is more or less dead because we didn't get the starting spot from that player. As we get closer to the season and their starting jobs become more cemented, they're going to get more and more expensive because they have fantastic fantasy profiles. That's the thing when you look at the 2 rookie quarterbacks. And when I say the 2 rookie quarterbacks, looking there at Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, the 2 rookie quarterbacks who we would anticipate actually playing, and probably playing almost from week 1, 2 quarterbacks who are much more expensive. They've got to go through the rookie learning pains. And at the same time, they actually have to be good fantasy quarterbacks for them to make a difference for you. That's the element of it that I think people aren't really looking at. And that's been our sort of refrain with Ridder and Howell since day one, is that if they do play, they have the perfect fantasy profile. Sam Howell ran for far more yards in his final season than Anthony Richardson did in his lone start last season. He has a game where he has 35 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown.
Yeah, lots of upside.
Early in the first month, he could get benched. You don't have any of those points. Having the guy out there actually playing is the key. And yet, this is the way that you're going to win tournaments, by having these cheap guys who can actually score points. And Colm, again, that was the thing that won last year with Jalen Hurts. A little bit different scenario, obviously, because he's going in the QB window as opposed to late, but someone who made a huge leap. Justin Fields, the guy that we recommended as maybe the most important player. He was our highest rostered QB through the first month. That looked disastrous. And then he comes on and now he's a top 5 pick overall. You want to get some of these guys before they have completely proven themselves. Otherwise, there's nowhere for them to go really other than getting injured and going down. I like how we're set up here.
Yeah, really like it. You mentioned too being above ADP. It's kind of 14, 15 picks. We take him at pick 98. It goes 115. It's not a drastic reach. And I think in Superflex, the ADP can be, from draft to draft can change so much. I think we're probably single-handedly, Shawn, increasing Sam Howell's ADP at this point, whether it's between us or the RotoViz OT community here as they draft as well. But the likes of Baker Mayfield's at the 112, which is the 1004. Ryan Tannehill went off the board. Brock Purdy went off the board. I think when you're in this range, I'm much more likely to go for the upside versus, the safety off a Mayfield or, for example, a Tannehill. But I think both could be interesting. You mentioned some of the potential question marks around Tannehill here as we move forward, but the team is shaping up nicely. We are 3 picks away. We're going to have 2 selections. Shawn, we are picking here at the 119. Jahan Dotson is potentially available. There's one more pick to go. He is ADP of 108. Will our dreams come true? Don't really hurt me here and take somebody else ahead of him. But who are we going to take, Shawn, here at the selection?
He does get to us. Obviously, he is a nice fit with Sam Howell. We will
get the Sam Howell stack too.
Pull the trigger there. That gets us to 5 wide receivers, all of whom have a ton of upside. Well, one of the nice things about going wide receiver early is that it formed that sort of flotilla of receivers that you need to win this type of format. And we know we're going to get some shots at interesting running backs late. Penny almost fell back to us. Rashad White almost fell back to us. They didn't, but that gives you an example of some of the guys who are right in that range. Here, Khalil Herbert, the top guy by ADP, A.J. Dillon, an option. Damian Harris, an option.
I think Herbert's the pick here, unless you want to overrule me.
So we go with Herbert there. His metrics last season at the very top of the NFL in terms of broken tackle rate, the yards after contact. He was the guy who was so explosive for the Bears and allowed them to move David Montgomery. And Montgomery, as we've mentioned a few times, probably a little bit undervalued at this point. But now that you have this 1-2 punch with Herbert, with D'Onta Foreman, that with a rushing QB, you're going to expect those guys to be extremely efficient, even if you do run into some problems where Justin Fields takes some of these rushing touchdowns. One of the things I was surprised about, and just in terms of thinking through it, when I wrote the D'Onta Foreman free agency article, was how many of the in-close touches Fields had really taken in that offense and how little Herbert had really been involved with that. And that doesn't mean that it won't involve next season. That doesn't mean that it won't evolve next season. Obviously, the Bears in the same position as so many of these other teams who have an elite rushing QB, where they're probably going to try and knock that down a little bit. One of the reasons that Fields sat in Week 18 was that the Bears didn't want to win that game, which was very smart on their part. But the reason that they had a lot of cover for that is that Justin Fields had the living daylights beaten out of him by that point. And so when they say, okay, we're going to not allow him to play in the final week, get a look at some other guys, make sure he's healthy going into next season, that made sense for everyone.
We have 2 running backs at the moment. We're going to see how we move going forward. Looking forward to going through the rest of the team. Really loaded up at wide receiver. We have Mark Andrews, tight end. Our quarterbacks are Jalen Hurts, Desmond Ridder, and Sam Howell. Running backs are Ramondre Stevenson, then paired with Khalil Herbert. And at wide receiver, it is truly absolutely loaded at this point. We obviously got our wide receiver 1 in Jahan Dodson. We got Keenan Allen. We got Christian Watson. We got Ceedee Lamb. We did get AJ Brown to go with Hurts. So really a loaded team at this point. We are 3 selections away from our pick at the 12-11. Shawn, 2 picks to we select again. Lots of flexibility, as we talked about, with the moves we made early in the draft to give us the options as we want to build out this team. Sky Moore in the queue. We have Antonio Gibson, Raheem Mostert. Who are you looking at this point? Is it time to start diving into rookies? Is it that second tight end? What is your excitement here 2 picks away? And I know you're quite excited this season about Raheem Mostert. So is he top of the list here, even though he's not top of the queue at the moment?
Mostert and Jeff Wilson both back in good situations there with Miami. I don't think that they would be guys that I would want to take at this level. Sadly, Sky Moore goes 1 pick ahead of us. That's tough. I think that Jalen Hyatt probably is the guy here of all the wide receivers. He's going a little bit below where I think that he should, looking at the rookies. Then we can come back with a running back in this next pick. The other pick that goes right ahead of us was Dalton Schultz. Colm, you and I had taken him in our previous Underdog draft as well. That would have given us an elite 1-2 punch at the tight end position. So really unfortunate, I think, that those last 2 selections were the guys that they happen to be. Cole Kmet here, the top tight end. We have Greg Dulcich. You and I really like to take Trey McBride. We really like to take Dalton Kincaid. Do you feel any interest? Do you feel any enthusiasm? Do you feel something tickling back there in the back of your head saying, I want to take Cole Kmet, or do you want to dive into one of these running backs? One of the things I would say about the running back group at this point is that it is relatively flat.
Yeah, it's quite flat at this point, and the excitement just isn't there as much as I would like. Cole Kmet, I think, is the pick. Between whom we selected, Okonkwo and Dulcich go off the board to the drafter at the 101. That gives us an option to pair Kmet with Mark Andrews. I would have been interested in a couple of the options that went off the board just ahead of us. The other player, Shawn, if it wasn't a Khalil Herbert team at this point, potentially would have had the interest there in D'Onta Foreman, who is going right around ADP in this range as well, but didn't want to go with the 2 Bears running backs paired together. So quite a flat range here off running backs, but the advantage of that is there is 19 selections to our next pick, but I think that the running backs going in that range are quite flat. The other part of it is there is a lot of interesting younger kind of wide receivers going in this range that may come back to us. But we are, Shawn, at this point, really, we're kind of maxing out our wide receiver room here as we move forward. We do have 20 picks in this draft, but we also have to allot some of them to additional positions. So Ramondre Stevenson so far, Khalil Herbert. I did tease it at the start, a little bit tongue-in-cheek maybe about our favorite late round picks, but there is going to be quite a bit of conversation around running backs here as we move forward to try and fill out this roster. How are you feeling, Shawn, so far? I'm sure it's pretty confident. We've got our 3 quarterbacks. I think we're pretty sealed up there. We've got 2 tight ends, potential, again, like you mentioned, with those younger guys to add in another one in a round or 2. And then we're really looking at just whatever wide receivers really pique our fancy, followed by running backs the rest of the way. Is that how you're feeling so far?
Yeah, with just the 2 running backs, we're going to try and hit that with volume down the stretch. And the Texas A&M back goes there at 149. He jumps out as being the number 1 back in Blair Andrews' backfield dominator rating, somebody that I think is really fascinating from that perspective. Blair also, in addition to the backfield dominator rating article, Blair did a fantastic deep breakdown of Chase Brown, a back who isn't expected to be drafted that early. Blair explains why maybe that's the case, but why it might be wrong. And Brown's someone that, even though he's an older back, the physical metrics really impressive. He tested well. He was very fast at the Senior Bowl, and Illinois rode him to an extent that's almost unfathomable. Someone that, even though he is in that 209 range, not the biggest back, probably has some ability even as a bell cow. We don't expect him to be used that way at the NFL level. And then another back who really jumps out here as being so interesting, especially for the price, is going to be Spears. He comes in as one of the top guys in BDR. And then you look at his physical results there at the combine with the explosiveness, and just someone, again, who very, very interesting from that perspective. And then we pull up Dave Cabin's breakaway rush scores, and we see these names at the top in DeWayne McBride, again in Brown, in Spears. And we have a variety of things pointing in the same direction. Now, because of where these guys are going to go in the reality draft and what their role is going to be as rookies, we want to be patient and not reach too early in these drafts. And yet, if there are going to be names who pop out as big risers post-draft, and we know that's the phenomenon that happens, obviously the guys who are sort of trendy but miss, going around 6, 7, maybe even go undrafted, then their ADP obviously
plummets.
Yeah, it gets torpedoed. Right, they no longer exist. You look at Sean Tucker, he's interesting, but these names that we've just been going over in Spears and McBride, and then Miller, somebody who plays for the NCAA runners up and is trying to get back from a health perspective. Out of this group, we're going to see at least one of these running backs absolutely skyrocket, if not a couple of them.
Raheem Mostert did not last to us. He goes at the 161, which is the 1405. We get Deontay Foreman, who we mentioned earlier, 1407. Shawn, some options here. I mentioned non-existent. Ezekiel Elliott here with an ADP of 155. Now, that is not me pitching to take him, but that is probably where he should have been drafted last year. That is the 1409. He does go at that selection. Jeff Wilson, though, Shawn, though, who we touched on, is an option potentially here. Devin Singletary. Then we're into the rookies in Tyjae Spears, who we have at the top of the queue here. How are you feeling at this point? There's just so many options. I'm very excited about the running back options we have moving forward here. Do you feel this is a spot to go with one of the rookies? I think we can go back to back probably with running backs here as we move through these picks. And I'll let you go with your preference, and I think it's going to be the rookie.
We're going to take Spears. I think he's just too fun in that spot. I think he's the most likely huge riser of any of the running back prospects. And then, Colm, the question that we have to answer when you look at the ADPs for some of these other guys, McBride down there in the 230s, Pierre Strong, someone in the 230s, could be that second year version of that, and then contrast them with some of the older, maybe less exciting players, a Jeff Wilson, who could be the 1A, a Devin Singletary, who might even be in a better situation this year than he was in last year.
Yeah.
Some interesting bets to kind of balance.
They're the two names that I would be looking at here as one of those veterans. I would probably lean Singletary, but I'm good to go with Wilson as well. And you are getting a 16 pick. In terms of ADP, Wilson, there's more chance of Singletary potentially coming back. So we did, due to me talking, Shawn, we missed our pick there. We got Miller. What's your thoughts on Miller? How excited are you about that pick turning into the league-winning selection here?
Yeah, I just think that his combination of athleticism, size.
Sorry for interrupting. Second question here. Was that a purposefully done auto pick, or was that done just because you were changing to the player that I mentioned?
Well, I was about to select Singletary for you, and then you mentioned the discount on Wilson. So we missed clicking Wilson by less than a second. We were right there.
I think it'll work out.
I think this was one of those where
it's a happy accident.
Yeah, we talked with Michael Leone when he was on the show a little over a year ago and was in the best ball finals with us, talking about how he had auto-picked Ben Roethlisberger. That had kind of worked out okay. Obviously, we've gotten stuck on some auto-pick selections at different times, especially here.
I'm still not sure if ours are auto picks or if Shawn is just choosing to pick his player at the top of the queue by not selecting the player that I've mentioned. I guess we'll never know.
Much more politically appropriate to be, it's too slow. Then no, I just ignore you.
I'm definitely not drafting Devin Singletary again. You're like, Devin Singletary, we've been through this last year, Colm.
Colin, when we were doing the playoff version of Underdog, which I think may still be my favorite contest that we've ever participated in, we had Brock Purdy all lined up for like round 9 and auto-picked him in round 6. And then a couple weeks later, his ADP was like
round 2.
Yeah. So I feel like this is going to be the same situation where you're going to be midway through this NFL season and you can either have Miller or Jeff Wilson. Be like, thank God we have Miller. That's the exciting one. That's the fun one. Colm, you know my philosophy on both fantasy football and life, which is that things tend to work out, and especially if you believe they will work out. I'm fired up about this pick. I love having a couple of rookies there.
And this is always the time to draft those rookies. You mentioned earlier the potential ascendance and value. There will be players who you draft at this point, but there is 20 rounds. In this draft, you kind of feel a little bit like you may have 1 or 2 shots at these rookies, and I think it's the way to play it. We did take Jalen Hyatt as well at wide receiver, so there's that option. Shawn, we were kind of focused very much on running back for these last couple of selections. When we do look at it, though, a couple of players here, Rondell Moore went off the board in this range. I think there is some interest in wide receivers, but I would much rather be trying to target in on those running backs. Kincaid goes off the board at the 186 pick, which is mid-16th round. I was kind of lining him up as the next option here for us at tight end. But he obviously goes. So we are now 3 selections away. Quite a drop-off in tight end really at this point. It almost feels like you could potentially hold out and roll with 2 tight ends, although I would like to probably have 3 in that room. We'll see how the draft continues to fall. 2 picks away, Shawn. The running backs that are in the queue outside of Sean Tucker, who at this point is a potential for us at our selection, heavy discount in terms of almost a full round in ADP. What is he somebody you're lining up here if he's last, or are you looking to jump to one of these guys who are a little bit later? Chuba Hubbard there is somebody who's very interesting, but he would be normally about 2.5 rounds after this. But Tucker goes off the board. You mentioned, Shawn, this is going to be a year where we go and get the guys and don't worry about ADP. And I think when you get into this range in the late 16th round, these guys are in a bucket together, and I think you go and get your guys. And I don't know about you, but I know Chuba Herbert is a guy kind of for you this year.
Yeah, and you look at that situation, obviously he has Miles Sanders in there with him. I don't know that Sanders is necessarily a bigger talent, even though we like Sanders. It's more a comment on Hubbard and what he brings to the table. The other guy here, in terms of explosiveness, someone who could be a big post-draft riser, Zach Evans has an ADP a little bit earlier. Do you have a preference between those two guys?
I think we'll go for Hubbard, and then we'll see Evans might slide back to us. Here we are picking in 4 picks. And again, it's like that thing when you're talking about the advantages of picking in the middle of the round as some of the values that you mentioned earlier in the draft fall in your way. But then when you're drafting at the start of a round, you can kind of pair some of these guys up and gives you a little bit of flexibility at this point. So we're hoping that Tim Patrick goes off the board. We're hoping one more pick here to get Evans back. This is a range for people listening that Leonard Fournette goes in. But like the Ezekiel Elliott mentioned earlier, probably put a line through him. If you can remove him from your draft board over at Underdog, go ahead and do it. But we are back on the board. Shawn Minshew goes off the board. The only other player that's really here is Irv Smith, but you have the controllers. We have 8 seconds to go. There was never a doubt.
So we'll go with Evans. And I mean, he's a player who did well at his pro day, not unreal, but has that sub 4.5 40 that you're looking for. His size speed combination there is going to be something that plays at the NFL level. He's never been a workhorse. And so when you look at his explosiveness, one of the most explosive backs in college football versus this ability to maybe be a really high touch back at the NFL level, there are going to be some trade-offs there. We don't know what backfield he's going to be dropped into. If he lands in a good spot, he's going to be a riser. He's someone I think is going to be one of the more fascinating backs to follow. Obviously a super high recruit, plays at TCU. You have the situation there where he leaves potentially in part because Miller, another back we already have drafted, was going to be an issue for him. He goes to Ole Miss. He plays well, but again, in some ways gets overshadowed by a teammate. But anytime that you have that type of sort of pedigree with the athleticism, with the explosiveness, those are the types of players that we're looking to add on to those are the types of players we're looking to add on to our fantasy teams.
Shawn, as things settle at the moment, we have 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 6 wide receivers, 2 tight ends. We have Jalen Hurts, Desmond Ridder, Sam Howell. Really happy with that quarterback room. We have Ramondre Stevenson, Khalil Herbert, Tyjae Spears, Kendre Miller, Chuba Hubbard, Zach Evans at running back. I think we're probably set there. The only concern you'd have is, people probably listening and, 3 rookies in there, and we haven't really extreme high-end talent, but I would class the guys that we have drafted as that. It's just that it hasn't factored into ADP yet. When we scroll down, the wide receiver Shawn, we have AJ Brown, Ceedee Lamb, Christian Watson, Keenan Allen, Jahan Dodson, Jalen Wyatt. That's loaded up. And then at tight end, we have Mark Andrews and Cole Kmet. We're 7 picks away. We have 3 selections left to go. I mentioned earlier, I think one more tight end will be ideal, but the options will be limited at this point. No offense there. Tyler Conklin, who I was impressed with Conklin last year with the Jets for what he did, but it's not something to get excited about. We're into these last rounds. Shawn mentioned Cade Auden a few times last year. He is there in this race going into his second year. Daniel Bellinger was somebody I like, but his value has kind of taken a big hit with the Waller signing or the trade there in New York with the Jets. So it feels to me, Shawn, like we need potentially the 1 tight end here, and then I'm probably looking at 2 wide receivers to finish things out. How are you feeling? Are you going 1 wide receiver, 1 running back, 1 tight end, or what's your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think we probably want to keep adding to the running backs. When you're late in the draft, you don't want to force picks. You want to take really good values. You don't want to have throwaway selections, which I think is what a lot of managers sort of end up shoehorning themselves into when they have a positional need or just want to have balance, as opposed to taking the pick that is the most likely to be a league winner. You look back at who actually wins these big tournaments, and they often do get the serious points from one of those late picks. If you're merely trying to fill positions, you're less likely to get that. Now, there's so much uncertainty with the late picks that even if you're just filling things, I mean, you could hit anyway. But we want to look and select the guys that we're most excited about late. And if we're weaker at running back, and those things fit, then we would hit there. I do have a couple of guys at receiver that I like. I think that John Mechie, if the health holds up, could easily be the number one receiver for Houston. That still might not be that much, but if you're the number one guy, it can be hard to not have some relevance. Marvin Mims, somebody who I think could easily end up being I'm not saying this is likely, but there's the potential for him to be as high as the wide receiver 2 in this class. So you would look at him late. We probably don't need to select him for another round or so. I think that some of these late tight ends are interesting. Noah Fant did just go. Jelani Woods, a guy who could be a big piece here if Indianapolis gets anything from the quarterback position. Laporta, someone who could be one of those rookie breakouts, and then Albert O, someone we're always looking at. Colm, I've made a couple of picks now. Who would you like here?
Well, this is kind of a pick towards you as well, but Mechie is there. It's 10 picks after ADP. I think that he is a pick here. In terms of the wide receivers available, he's definitely one of the options I would like to get. Didn't have as much of a gap between the running backs we have available, and I think those tight ends are the 20th round selections here for us. So we have one pick to go, and I mentioned that Jelani Woods has gone off the board once I mentioned that as a potential 20th round pick. But Shawn, we are back on the clock. So I want wide receiver, you want running back?
Yeah, I mean, you had 1 or 2 receivers. We can definitely go that way. I think that to win, we're probably going to need those early receivers to hit. Pierre Strong, Jerome Ford, 2 guys, again, that I do like to take late. Make another pick for us here, Colm.
Any concerns with Strong and Stevenson? We have 6 seconds left. If you don't, take Strong. We go with Ford. That's a question. Just I think sometimes people might think of that, and I mentioned it earlier with the 2 running backs avoiding Foreman for the Bears. Is that something you factor in? I would rather have more shots at more backfields than lock down one backfield. So taking the 2 New England running backs in this draft, is that something that you look at? I think people like, maybe this is like maybe people who are new to fantasy would say like still the handcuff option. That's not something that I really go for.
As you mentioned, I think a lot of people, when they're thinking through how they want their running back room to look, are going to find it interesting that opposed to wanting the handcuff, that you're saying that you want to go at the very far end of the spectrum from that, where we're trying to avoid running backs on the same team. I'm going to look at it as a little bit more team agnostic, where I want to have the biggest talents late. And so Pierre Strong, one of those players I think can be a 3-down back. He's got the long speed. He was a workhorse in college. We actually saw him make, just a couple, but flash a little bit in the passing game. If he can do that, then he would be our Ramondre Stevenson type of fill-in. One of the most recent reports is that James Robinson, even though he's there, and even though you and I really like him, he might be a threat to not even make the team, just be a special teams kind of player, that Pierre Strong could still be the guy. And so it wouldn't be necessarily a handcuff selection, but I also wouldn't necessarily avoid him. But the value of going with Ford is that if anything were to happen to Nick Chubb, and we definitely hope that it doesn't, it seems like Ford could be very involved in this offense. Someone who, after he transferred from Alabama, was extremely impressive at Cincinnati. He has some of that athleticism that you're looking for. And again, we're just trying to get as much, I'd just say big playability, but players who could be slightly above average. And when you're talking about the NFL level, someone who is above average is very, very good. When you're looking at running backs this deep, maybe you're even going for just someone who's slightly below average, but not a plotter, not somebody that they're going to fill in and then a week later be like, really anybody could do that. So we don't necessarily expect to hit because there's a lot of uncertainty and you hope the starter stays healthy. But in an offense like what the Browns have been most of the time under Kevin Stefanski, and even before that, you think that their running game, and you think about all the interest that's been around Ernest Johnson in the past. And part of that goes back to him. His specific splits to himself, like his actual advanced stats, how well he does breaking tackles and that type of thing. The way he played on the field created some of that enthusiasm. It's not just that he was in Cleveland, but I think that if you can get an enticing back in that offense late, then that's something that we're looking to do. When we're heading down the stretch here, it is round 20. We do just have the 2 tight ends. I guess I am comfortable with that, with those tight ends being Mark Andrews and Cole Kmet. Obviously, if you have an injury, then you're looking a little bit thinner. But I think Andrews gives us the flexibility to go any direction that we would like here. Albert O, obviously, still interesting, regardless of what else is going on. So if you had a different player at a different position that you had to have, I think that we could do that. We're 5 picks away. We're not going to have Mr. Irrelevant, but we will have the second to last pick in this draft. Names on the board just to give people a sense of where we are. Tyler Conklin, Malik Willis, Andy Dalton, Darius Slayton. I don't think that we're going to pick any of those guys. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I mean, there's still a tiny possibility that he could factor in Kansas City or somewhere else. I say again, tiny possibility. It is interesting that Pierre Strong did go and James Robinson is still available. You have Trask still on the board here. He could be the starter with the Buccaneers, which would be interesting. They are going to have some pretty good wide receivers, and Marvin Mims doesn't make it back to us. He goes at the 2007. So getting deep here, Bailey Zappi, a pick. He could be the starter for the New England Patriots. What are your thoughts?
What about Cade Otton? I've mentioned his name a few times here. He hasn't been added to the queue. I feel like I'm not getting to that pick. I feel like this is Albert O if he gets back to us, Sean. I probably would go with Otton just for the poor feeling I have last year after Albert O. My heart is still shattered.
I think that you and I timed out on Otton in a previous draft in the 20th round, and that may be enough exposure for me.
He's somebody that I do think there's something potentially there. But I also think
so you would prefer the tight end in Tampa Bay over the potential starting quarterback there.
Yeah. I also think that you're taking Trask. We're getting Trask. I would have. You're not going Albert O? No, we didn't. We went with Trask. We timed it. Okay.
So we wrap up the draft with
the one thing I'm sure that
no consensus are on the 20th round pick.
Yeah, there is a joy, I think, in the people listening in as they chuckle along it. I do think one of the, I guess we'll say the bits that we do, but Shawn has full control over the majority of it. But we do take Trask. We'll have a run through the team here. We'll give it a quick review, our thoughts. But yeah, let us know. Would you rather have Kyle Trask as your fourth tight end, or your fourth quarterback, or would you rather have Otton as your third tight end? Let us know. Send it my way on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. We will review at a further date. Shawn, let's run through the roster. And if you happen to be watching, obviously on the YouTube channel, drop it in the comments below. But we do now have a 4 quarterback room. We have Jalen Hurts, we have Desmond Ridder, we have Sam Howell, we have Kyle Trask. We're loading up on those young quarterbacks. We have Ramondre Stevenson, Khalil Herbert, Tyjae Spears, Kendre Miller, Chuba Hubbard, Zach Evans, and Jerome Ford, AJ Brown, Ceedee Lamb, Christian Watson, Keenan Allen, Jahan Dodson, Jalen Hyatt. Then we have John Mechie at the back end of that wide receivers room. Tight ends, Mark Andrews, Cole Kmet. I do think if you're going for, a 2 tight end build, having one of those, I would say elite options, Shawn. I'm sure you still pretty much agree that he would fit into that tier of elite tight end options, and Mark Andrews makes that a lot easier to run with. Looking through the team, Shawn, 7 running backs, 7 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, 4 quarterbacks. Any picks as we move through the draft that you would potentially look to change up here as we look back from the 102? There was a couple where it was like, the running backs were a little bit flat, but I felt, again, like I mentioned when we drafted last week, because of the structure, because of the way we were setting up the roster here, I felt as if when we were in kind of round 13 onwards there, I thought we had a multitude of options. If we look at the draft board in terms of the wide receiver options going in those last 5-6 rounds, it's a much tougher process. So obviously, if you're going with the wide receivers early and passing up on those running backs, it feels, I guess, for the way we're drafting, it's going to give us a lot of flexibility later on. But I don't have a huge amount of ones that I would change outside of our 20th pick. The one that we obviously auto drafted on, in hindsight, do we change there, or do we stick with Miller? I believe it was we drafted at that selection.
Yeah, when you're looking at him early in the 15, I don't have any problem with that at all. We'll see whether that becomes a great value or someone who does continue to fall a little bit. The pivot points come down to those selections, I think, at the 2-3 turn, because we could have taken Jonathan Taylor instead of A.J. Brown. That was something we strongly considered. We could have taken Austin Eckler, Saquon Barkley instead of Ceedee Lamb. I like the way that this draft turned out. I think that having the receiving firepower to go with Jalen Hurts, and also when you have that elite tight end, there are so many things that can go right for you. Obviously, the thing that can go wrong is that you lose your elite tight end to injury. But, I mean, this is the type of team that wins tournaments. The flip side of that is that we look back and say, with how running backs fall in this day and age, you probably don't ever need to get yourself in a position where you end up quite this thin. And so I think there are some things that you can do to potentially address that, the issue that you have. And one of the reasons that we do talk a lot about drafting from back to front as well, and not that you're going to change your draft, but you at least want to think through the consequences. One of the elements that we really like about taking Ridder and Howell in one QB formats, where you're not necessarily taking a QB in the first round on top of having them, is that the price is extremely cheap. Here, as you mentioned, DeAndre Swift goes one pick ahead of Ridder. Now, if Swift had made it one more slot, we would have selected him and hoped that Ridder came back around. And if he didn't, we just would have taken Howell. The interesting thing there about whether or not it made sense to wait, that was a question that we asked. I think that Levis was the last guy then who would have been interesting. He didn't make it back to us in round 10. So picking Howell here, I do think was the smart move. Now, if you pass yourself, you change a little bit of the future dynamic. So it's possible that that would have allowed another QB to come back around. But you mentioned Trask. Baker Mayfield goes here in the 10:04. I think that he wins that job with the Buccaneers. We've made some selections in some other drafts, including specifically in Superflex, where we gambled a little bit on that. We picked him in round 20 of one of our previous Superflex drafts. I think he'll be the starter, but I also don't think that the gap between Mayfield and Trask is the gap between round 10 and the 2011. So that's one of the reasons why I think we want to get a little bit of exposure to Trask if there's not somebody else that we're completely locked in on. And the fact that again, it's just basically 25-ish seconds that you have. But when we go back and forth and don't really like any of the options, I think that that is an indication to us that we don't really have a pick. And if you don't have a pick, I think that's when it makes sense to go for the QB in Superflex. It was the last round pick and not the earlier selections that we had made that was such a big deal for us last season. So even though we think in terms of Ridder and Howell as being the guys, maybe Trask is the player. Again, when you have a Chris Godwin, when you have a Mike Evans, you don't expect him to be this big-time fantasy scorer, but you wouldn't have expected that from Geno Smith last year either. And it's not that Smith went out there and scored a ton of points, but especially in Superflex, very competitive with that. So I like where we were there. The question then comes back to the running back position. And one of the things that did happen to us after we passed on the guys at the 2-3, which again is one of the reasons why the 2-3 was so important. We would have liked to have taken two back-to-back at the 4-5, probably, because there are some other things that you can do as opposed to taking Mark Andrews. And I like the way that that worked out. So there's no regret there. But if ETN had gotten back through, we picked Stevenson, and then went ETN, Debo, and we picked Mark Andrews, we would have taken ETN. The same thing basically happens at the 6-7, where we picked Christian Watson at 6-11, and then in between our picks, the turn was JSN and Gibbs. So that drafter goes with two rookies, including the rookie running back, who I think would have been a fantastic pick as opposed to Keenan Allen. Again, we like Keenan Allen. We're probably going to end up with plenty of him. Then you have the two quarterbacks. And by the time that you get done with that and you're picking in round 10, suddenly, even though running backs are, arguably good values throughout this draft, you look at round 9, and round 9 has Joe Mixon, who probably isn't a good pick, but at least there's a chance that he could still be the starter in Cincinnati. Then you have Akers, I think a sneaky pick there, especially if the Rams offense jumps right back to where it was in 2021. You can't anticipate that, but it is a possibility. right? And then you have Javonte Williams. He would be going far, far earlier, if not for some of the injury questions. I think especially if you have other running backs on your team, you look at the second half of the season, Javonte Williams could be one of the highest scoring running backs in the entire league, like that pick. And then James Cook, probably too inexpensive due to the Damian Harris signing. It's one of those kind of funny things where people aren't that excited about Harris, but they are worried about how it hurts Cook. Anyway, you have a lot of really good values there, but then you also have the good value in round 10, falling to the 10-10, which is Rashad Penny. That was one pick ahead of where we took Dotson. So, Colm, one of the things that happened in this draft is that the running backs we were targeting did go just right ahead of our pick, as opposed to, say, 5 or 6 picks earlier. That is going to be something that happens in your drafts, and you have to be ready to adjust to it. I like what we did by adjusting with the young runners. In a perfect world, we'd have a little bit more running back firepower.
Yeah, and there is some options there as you talk through it that we could have changed. You've talked me around on the quarterback situation, but that quarterback situation and pick and Trask only works with the Mark Andrews pick that we took, because I know at that point we did talk between him and Judy as potential options. We did go with Mark Andrews, but the way the wide receivers did play out after feels pretty strong. So there is sometimes for us, and I think when you're picking at a turn as well, Shawn, it's much more evident sometimes of the, the 1v1s or the 2v2s that we talk about after. Sometimes if you're in the middle, it's like, well, that pick was 3 picks away, 4 picks away, 5 picks away, where it's very evident with the turn picks, for example, or the picks before. Is the Penny pick was one that I really would have liked to get there. But then if we take him, we miss out, Shawn, on our boy Dotson, and then the draft just wouldn't have been as much fun, to do in that scenario. But I think overall we've ended up with a really strong team. It is going to be dependent, as you mentioned, on the rookie firepower of where some of these rookie running backs land. Do they get an opportunity? You were going through the options too. You mentioned Penny. There is also Rashad White at the 10:05, Tyler Algier at the 10:01. There's lots of interesting running backs in that 9-10 range, and that was the range where we take Howell and then Dotson. But it is quite a tricky one to think of how we would have potentially got out of that Howell pick. We had talked about wanting to draft him. Would he come back? I don't think he would have. If he came back, he was in that same pick that we were hoping the Penny would have got to. So we were in a range there, I think, more so where in Superflex there's quite a few options that we do like, and we were probably going to have a decision to make at that point anyway. But overall, I'm very pleased with this draft, Shawn. Very happy with it. We could have went, as you mentioned, with Jonathan Taylor over AJ Brown. Then we could have, at that point, we may still have got Ceedee Lamb. But I think if we do that, are you passing at that point on Stevenson for the options, which would have probably been Mark Andrews or Jerry Jeudy, who we talked about as our potential options at those two selections? Is that what you'd be hoping for, is to come out of those with, let's say this is our first 5 picks: Jalen Hurts, Jonathan Taylor, Ceedee Lamb, Mark Andrews, Jerry Jeudy? Would that be more preferential to you than what we have in Hurts, Brown, Lamb, Stevenson, and Andrews?
No. The reason that we would be looking at Jonathan Taylor and then in the 3rd round, potentially Barkley, Eckler, even a Breece Hall, who, again, if you have a different draft slot, you can do some different things. You want to make sure you maximize whatever the benefits of your draft slot are. You don't control that, but wherever you are, you've got to draft into that and really take advantage. So Breece Hall falls to the middle of round 4. I mean, that's far too late, but he's not going to get back to us. We can't sit around and complain. At the 302, we got Ceedee Lamb, which is a player we would have drafted ahead of him. Ramondre Stevenson there is, I think, far better than the receiving options who are available. Debo is the next wide receiver taken. Then you get DeAndre Hopkins, an interesting guy, but perhaps the reports of him staying in Arizona mitigate a little bit of the enthusiasm, knock down some of the upside, also knock down some of the enthusiasm for guys like Rondale Moore and Marquise Brown. But then Calvin Ridley, a player who, I hope that draft pick works. I hope that where Ridley is going in drafts is how he plays next season. But when you look at the way that offense runs and the spread nature of it, and the fact that we're just always overly excited about these guys coming back. The guys coming back from suspension have not performed well. I guess I don't understand how he goes ahead of Christian Kirk and possibly even Zay Jones. Now, Ridley has been so good in the past that, you can understand the Zay Jones part of it. But one of the things with Ridley is that he was having trouble even there in Atlanta in that season that was truncated. Now, partly that may have been because of the personal reasons that he needed to address. And if those are fully addressed, he comes back, he explodes. I mean, Calvin really hasn't been a priority target for us. But I think when you're looking at the next guys as being Debo, Hopkins, Ridley, and you have a Ramondre Stevenson, you mentioned in part one of our coverage of this particular draft that you think that Stevenson is an emerging guy who could be in some ways like the guy. This Patriots offense should be better this season. Ramondre Stevenson is a high-value touch machine. Again, because there are going to be 6-7 players sort of in the mix for it, you wouldn't say, okay, well, Ramondre Stevenson is going to be the running back one, but that's a possibility. And so when you look at that there, I think you prefer to have him in round 4 than to lose that Taylor, A.J. Brown switch at 2. And certainly the pick there at 3, but it does create those cascading problems as we work our way down through. So really the question might be, go ahead and take Gibbs instead of Christian Watson. I think that would be the way to play it.
Interesting. And it's always good to have these conversations after. I'm hoping that the people listening are enjoying it. They're getting some, usable information out of it that they can implement into their own drafts, because you mentioned there as well, we haven't talked about it much this year in our drafts, drafting from back to front. I think that is kind of, sometimes you mention about certain things being superpowers. I do think that is something that really does benefit people in their drafts. And we will be talking about that throughout more drafts, but it's one of the first times just that I think has been mentioned this year, knowing what way you're going to go in those backgrounds. And you mentioned, some of the running backs going, being able to know where you're going to pivot. That is one of the key parts of it. But that is going to take us to the end of today's show. If you haven't listened yet, I'm sure people have listened to the first part of this draft if they're listening to the second part. But if you haven't listened to the first part yet, where we go through those opening 10 or so rounds, do check that out. It was released on Monday. Thank you for tuning into today's show. It's been a lot of fun already. This, I guess we'll say off season, but we're kicking it into NFL draft season. We'll have a lot of draft shows coming up, lots of content to go through, but looking forward to sharing that with the RotoViz OT community, which it has been just so much fun interacting with all of you over the last couple of weeks and months. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. Shawn Siegele is obviously my co-host. You can check out all his work up on rotoviz.com, and including one of the Dynasty workshops that released over the past couple of days. Make sure you check that out, talking about some of his latest advice in the Dynasty sphere. We'll be back with our third show of the week on Friday, so stay tuned for that. Make sure you're subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. And until we are back, have a good one.